Before a single machine could be reliably repaired, someone had to solve a problem most people never thought to name. If a bolt broke on a cotton mill in 1810, the replacement had to come from the same workshop that made the original. No other bolt would fit. Every thread was cut by hand, at whatever pitch the craftsman happened to prefer that week. Two bolts from two different shops looked identical from across a room and fit nothing interchangeably. This wasn't carelessness. It was simply how metalwork had always operated. One maker, one tolerance, one machine at a time. A factory floor in the early industrial period wasn't a system. It was a collection of individual relationships between parts and their original makers. When something broke, you didn't reach for a spare, you sent for the man who made it. That dependency had a cost. Downtime was expensive, repairs were slow, expansion was hard to plan around. The screw itself was ancient. Wooden screws had been used in wine and olive presses since Roman times, maybe earlier. Metal screws appeared in European clockmaking and armor by the 15th century, but they were hand-filed, precious, and irreplaceable. Each one was a small custom object. Losing one wasn't a minor inconvenience, it was a manufacturing problem. A clockmaker in 1750 might spend more time fitting a single screw than assembling the mechanism around it. The thread angle, the pitch, the diameter. None of it followed any external standard because no external standard existed. What changed wasn't the screw's basic shape. What changed was the idea that screws from different sources should fit the same hole. That idea sounds obvious now. In 1800, it was genuinely radical. The person most credited with pushing it forward in Britain was Joseph Whitworth, a machinist from Manchester who had an almost compulsive interest in precision measurement. Whitworth had worked under Henry Maudslay, who had already developed better lathes and screw-cutting tools in the early 1800s. Maudslay's contribution was the precision screw-cutting lathe, a machine that could reproduce threads consistently rather than relying on a craftsman's feel. But consistent within one workshop still wasn't the same as consistent across workshops. Whitworth's proposal in 1841 was deceptively simple. Measure the actual threads in use across British industry and pick the most common angles and pitches. He examined dozens of sample screws from working factories, found that most clustered around a 55-degree thread angle, and recommended standardizing around that. The result became the British standard Whitworth thread, the first nationally adopted screw standard in the world. It didn't cover every size. It wasn't perfect, but it was agreed upon, and agreement was the thing that had been missing. A bolt made in Birmingham could now, in principle, fit a nut made in Sheffield. That was new. The uptake wasn't instant. Manufacturers who had built entire product lines around their own thread dimensions didn't rush to retool. Retooling meant replacing taps, dies, gauges, and lathes. Real money, real disruption. Some firms held out for years, not from ignorance, but from rational calculation about switching costs. What accelerated adoption was railway expansion. Britain's rail network in the 1840s and 1850s needed enormous quantities of standardized fasteners. A locomotive had thousands of screws and bolts. If each manufacturer used a different thread, maintenance across a network became a logistical nightmare. Railway companies began specifying Whitworth threads in their procurement contracts, and that purchasing power moved the market. Suppliers who wanted railway contracts standardized. Suppliers who standardized undercut those who didn't. The economics did most of the work. Across the Atlantic, the same problem was developing independently, and the solution went in a slightly different direction. William Sellers presented a competing standard to the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia in 1864, recommending a 60-degree thread angle instead of Whitworth's 55. The Sellers thread, which became the basis for what Americans eventually called the Unified Thread Standard, was easier to manufacture because the flat crest and root were simpler to cut accurately. American industry, which was expanding rapidly after the Civil War, adopted the Sellers standard with less resistance than Britain had shown to Whitworth. The U.S. government formally endorsed it for military procurement in 1868, and from there it spread through American manufacturing as railway contracts had spread the Whitworth thread in Britain. For decades, a British bolt and an American bolt of the same nominal diameter simply would not interchange. The threads were close but incompatible. That gap caused real problems wherever British and American equipment appeared in the same workshop or on the same vehicle. During the Second World War, when Allied forces operated mixed equipment across theaters, the incompatibility between British Whitworth and American unified threads became a documented logistical issue. A mechanic's kit that worked on American trucks wouldn't necessarily work on British vehicles, even when the parts looked identical. That pressure eventually led to a joint agreement in 1949 between the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom to create a unified thread standard, a single system both sides could use. It took a world war and several years of negotiation to reconcile what two 19th century engineers had separately but almost simultaneously solved. The screw hadn't changed much. The argument was always about the thread geometry, not the basic concept. Meanwhile, the manufacturing of screws themselves had undergone a transformation that was just as significant as the standardization debate. Hand-filing threads was never going to produce screws at the volume industrial manufacturing required. The screw machine, a type of automatic lathe that could produce finished screws from rod stock with minimal operator intervention, began developing in earnest in the mid-19th century. By the 1880s, screw machines could produce hundreds of identical fasteners per hour. By the early 20th century, thousands per hour. The cost of a screw dropped so far that it stopped being a line item worth thinking about. A furniture maker in 1780 used screws sparingly, partly because they were expensive, partly because each one was slightly different from the last. A furniture maker in 1920 bought screws by the gross and didn't think twice about the decision. That shift in cost changed design. Products could be built with more fasteners, making them easier to assemble and, in theory, easier to repair. In theory, because repair assumes the replacement screw is the same as the original. Standardization made that assumption reasonable for the first time. Before that, a repairman working on someone else's machine was partly a detective, figuring out what the original maker had done. After standardization, the same repairman could carry a small assortment of standard sizes and handle most jobs without custom fabrication. That change in repair logic rippled through manufacturing design itself. Engineers began designing products around standard fastener sizes rather than specifying custom threads that only their own suppliers could produce. This sounds like a minor efficiency. It was actually a restructuring of how industrial supply chains worked. A manufacturer no longer needed a captive workshop producing custom hardware they could buy from any supplier meeting the standard. Competition among fastener suppliers drove prices down further. Standardization and cheapness reinforced each other in a loop that took decades to fully develop. The screw also quietly shaped assembly line logic. Henry Ford's factories famously depended on interchangeable parts, and fasteners were the connective tissue of that interchangeability. You cannot have a moving assembly line if the bolts attaching one component don't reliably accept the nuts arriving from a different supplier. The tolerance stack, the accumulated variation across dozens of parts, had to stay within limits, and standardized threads were part of how that was controlled. A Model T had around 5,000 fasteners. Ford's purchasing and quality systems treated screw thread compliance as a baseline requirement, not an engineering achievement. By that point, a standardized screw thread was infrastructure, the same way standard rail gauge was infrastructure. You only noticed it when something violated it. The material of the screw itself evolved alongside standardization. Early machine screws were iron, which corroded, stripped, and snapped under load. Steel replaced iron as Bessemer and open hearth processes made it cheap enough for commodity hardware in the late 19th century. Zinc plating arrived as a corrosion solution for mild steel screws used in damp or outdoor environments. Stainless steel fasteners followed, first for chemical and food industry use, where corrosion was a serious operational problem, then gradually into consumer goods. Today, a single industrial fastener catalog lists screws by material, thread standard, head type, drive type, coating, and length, hundreds of combinations descending from decisions made in the 1840s and 1860s. The drive type is its own story. The simple slotted screw head is older than industrial manufacturing and works reasonably well when you are turning it slowly by hand. It works less well when you are trying to drive it quickly with a powered tool, because the driver tends to slip out of the slot under torque. That slipping, called cam out, damages the head, slows the line, and frustrates everyone involved. The Phillips head, developed in the 1930s and adopted by American automakers almost immediately, was specifically designed to cam out under high torque. That sounds like a flaw, and in home repair it often is. On an assembly line in 1936 it was a feature. Cam out prevented over-tightening, which had been stripping threads and cracking components at scale. The Phillips head was an engineering compromise that made sense for one context and became ubiquitous enough to define the experience of screws for everyone else. The Robertson square drive, developed in Canada around 1908, resisted cam out without the Phillips limitation and is genuinely superior for most applications. Canadian manufacturing adopted it widely. American automakers mostly didn't, partly due to licensing disagreements with the inventor, partly due to existing tooling investments. That decision, made in boardrooms in the 1910s and 1920s, is why most Americans still reach for a Phillips screwdriver even when a square drive would serve them better. Infrastructure decisions made a century ago determining what tool fits in your kitchen drawer, That is how standardization actually works in practice. The Torx head came later, in 1967, offering even better cam-out resistance, and finding its way into automotive, electronics, and eventually consumer products. But each new drive type added a new tool requirement, which is why a complete screwdriver set now has 15 bits where one slot driver once sufficed. The proliferation of drive types is a small irony inside the larger story of standardization. More standards, not fewer, once the market fragments by application. Metric versus imperial thread standards created another layer of parallel systems that manufacturing and repair work still navigates. Most of the world uses metric fasteners following ISO standards developed through the mid-20th century. The United States uses a mix, metric in automotive and electronics, unified inch threads in construction, plumbing, and older industrial equipment. A mechanic working on a domestic American car from 1975 needs different sockets than one working on a Japanese car from the same year. The tools are different, the fasteners are different, and the underlying standards that produce them are different, all because two industrializing nations solved the same problem independently and never fully merged the solutions. Historians and engineers sometimes point out that full global fastener harmonization has been technically achievable for decades. The barrier has never been knowledge. It's the installed base, billions of existing machines, tools, and structures built to one standard, making the cost of switching always exceed the benefit. Some details in the early history of screw standardization remain disputed or thinly documented, and different engineering histories weigh the contributions of Maudslay, Whitworth, and Sellers differently. What's less disputed is the practical outcome. By 1900, a machinist in a well-equipped shop could buy a bolt, expect it to fit a purchased nut, and repair equipment without sending back to the original maker. That expectation, ordinary now, genuinely new then, changed what manufacturing could attempt. Machines could be designed for disassembly. Factories could be supplied by multiple vendors. Equipment could travel and still be serviced. The screw didn't make the Industrial Revolution, but the standardized screw made the Industrial Revolution repairable. And a system that cannot be repaired cannot scale. The one sitting in your wall, or holding a hinge, or buried in the back of a device you'll never open. It fits a gauge that two engineers argued about in the 19th century and governments agreed on in the 20th. It is an agreement more than an object, and agreements, when they hold, become invisible.